To begin with, I just wanted to take a quick poll before I started. I wondered how many of you are in favor of a violent revolution to overthrow the United States government in favor of a completely new and different form of governance? By a show of hands. In the back? Yeah, nobody. Of course not. Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today, and that's what I'm going to be warning you about. So, let's get right to it. Marxism itself is not a form of government. Many people think that it is, and they suppose that when a country would change its governing body to Marxism, that it would be a Marxist-style government. There's actually no such thing as a Marxist-style government. That is a misnomer. Marxism is simply the means by which a government is usurped and overthrown. So it is a way to dispose of the current government in favor of typically socialism. That's usually what the alternative is. That's been the case historically, and that's why wherever we see Marxism employed in a country, what you end up with is a form of socialism or communism that is very violent and very totalitarian and fascistic in nature. So there is no Marxism as a form of government. Marxism, and that's kind of the sleight of hand of Marxism, it's really just a means by which to get rid of the current government in order to replace it with something new. So how does that work? For as complicated as people typically think Marxism is, I would say that you could summarize it based on what I've just told you in two words: ideological subversion. That's what Marxism is. That's the means by which it corrodes the current system and allows it to collapse, and then creates the vacuum for something new to replace it. What is ideological subversion? Well, many of you were in classes of mine and currently are. Ideological subversion is based on ideology, which itself is a fundamental belief system. And so you'll recall they typically come in three forms. We see religious ideologies, political ideologies, and social ideologies. Ideology should not be thought of as a belief, among other beliefs. Ideology is the belief upon which all other beliefs are predicated. So they're firm, they almost never change, and they're very difficult to get in and tinker with if you were interested in subverting ideology, which is what makes Marxism so pernicious. So, we're talking about a national ideology. And so what would the national ideology of the United States be? Because that's what is at stake right now. Americanism, basically. So when you think of Americanism, what types of things do you think about? Perhaps you think about apple pie, or hamburgers, or rock and roll, or freedom, or democracy, or capitalism, or Columbus discovering America, or Plymouth Rock, or Elvis, or maybe Thanksgiving. These are all elements that kind of comprise the American ideology, our mindset. So the idea being that you could encounter another American anywhere in the world, and you would all be able to relate to those concepts of ideology. Those are the things that make you American. There are many others, obviously. I just threw a few out there. Ideology itself is mystical. In other words, it's not clear whether it's true or not. So we have this old myth that they told us, they probably don't do it anymore, but when I was in elementary school, we got the story of George Washington who chopped down the cherry tree. And then when he was asked about it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie." He was honest and good-natured, and so even though he did this bad thing by cutting down the cherry tree, he couldn't lie about it, and he told the truth. I have no idea whether that's true or not. It's probably not. It's probably just a myth that's made up to support the national ideology. But you would find elements like that in and among any sort of ideology. Take religion, for example. Religion is full of all kinds of mysticism. The Bible or the Abrahamic faiths are loaded with instances of miracles. Now, if you're a believer, you would suppose that those are true and they literally happened. Or you might suppose that those are metaphors and that they're placed in there in order to direct you, orient you in the right direction, rather. And so that is the value there. I don't know whether the American mystical ideas of ideology actually happen or not, and I think it actually doesn't matter. It's sort of irrelevant. So these are ritualistic, and they're not necessarily true. They don't have knowable truth values. But the loss of ideology in a country signals the end of it. The collapse in any country always occurs as the national ideology erodes. We saw this in 1991 in the Soviet Union. And I think we're seeing it today in our own country, sadly. We now operate within a closed loop of indoctrination in this country. From universities to K through 12 schools, they have embraced and funded and advanced by rank and file politicians with taxpayer money these pernicious ideas of Marxism. And I would ask you, what is the mandate under which we undertook this process or this operation? Who authorized us as K through 12 teachers or as college professors to set about indoctrinating students into Marxist ideology? Where did that come from? Do you think the taxpayers would be okay knowing that they're funding the revolution? Because they are. We all make and earn our paychecks, and that's based on a windfall of free taxpayer money. Unless you're a private school, then you're relying a lot less on that. So private schools to some degree have been able to avoid this. But I would ask that question, where does this mandate come from? Where did we get the right to do this? Who authorized us? Who said, look, we took a vote on this and the consensus was that we want you all to begin indoctrinating students in K through 12 and then continue it right on up through universities? And I think the obvious answer to that is no one did that. We took this upon ourselves. So, what is Marxism? What is it? Great question. It is ideological subversion. It is the means by which you re-engineer society by seizing the ideological means of production. Marx believed and heavily argued in favor of two things, and that was that private property should be abolished and that the means of production ought to be seized by the workers. Now, when you begin Marx, he's talking about these two things in the context of doing away with private property. So we think, well, the general public would just come to own everything, and that way we wouldn't have people who are exceedingly wealthy because they own property and they can hoard it for themselves. It has a practical application. And then seizing the means of production seems to align, for Marx in the beginning at least, with taking over the factories. So you would have some collective of workers that now would be in charge of or would technically own through perhaps employee shares or something like this. They would own that means of production. But Marx pulls a little sleight of hand there because he makes a distinction between infrastructure and superstructure. So the infrastructure would be the actual factories that have a means of production and the people of wealth and means who control those. But then he moves from there to the superstructure. And what he's talking about in superstructure is the ideology of the country in question. So when Marx says that he wants to see private property abolished, what he's really saying is that he wants the quote unquote property of ideology, the private property of ideology abolished. So you may hear discussion in college courses of now you hear the term whiteness a lot, right? We've got to do away with whiteness. We've got to abolish whiteness. It's a bad thing. Whiteness is the form of private property. It's ideological private property. If you have whiteness, then you can use that like capital. You can go into the society and you can invest it, and in light of having this whiteness, other good things can come to you that would be inaccessible to other people who don't have the property of whiteness. So that's what he's really talking about when he says he wants private property abolished, and that's the sleight of hand. He wants ideological private property abolished. And the means of production of that ideology occurs in the schools, which is where we learned about Americanism and how to be patriotic and what the country stood for and the founding fathers and the principles and the myths and all of those things. And so that is the ideological means of production that he's talking about seizing. So it's very important to see that sleight of hand with Marx. On the surface, it sounds like he's talking about factories and rich people. And like, who wouldn't be for that, right? The rich people, they have too much money. They're hoarding everything up for themselves. And, maybe it would be better if the workers had some investment or share in the companies in which they worked. So it sounds reasonable in the beginning until he moves to what he's really talking about. This is a symbolic and metaphorical exercise. So, how is the American ideology or the American mindset reproduced in society? Well, it's typically done through families, schools, and other civic institutions. They all function together like little factories to reproduce this American ideology and to reify it, to shore it up, to make sure that we all have a sense of being Americans and that we're all involved and we're all in this together. We lead with our humanity first and those sorts of things, ideally. Here's what's important to note. Power itself can only be seized temporarily. However, if I seize control, meaning I seize control of the means of ideological reproduction, that is much more effective than seizing power in and of itself, because now I have a way to protect the power that I've seized. So seizing control is much more important than simply seizing power. We have two political parties in this country that vie back and forth for power. We have elections and this party comes into power, that party leaves power. But if you could actually seize control, then you would be able to determine who's able to come to power and who isn't. So it's far more important to seize the means of control than it is simply power itself, because they go hand in hand once you have seized control. Now, what is ideological subversion specifically, and how do they carry this out in K through 12 schools and universities? Primarily, I would assert through the manipulation of language. And one of the means by which they do this is a theory that comes from our humanities and English departments. And this is called social constructivism. Social constructivism is the idea that everything that we consider real, that we agree on, that's around us, is nothing more than an agreement, an implicit agreement that we all have, that we're going to simply agree that this is what that thing shall be. There's no objectivity to it. So for example, some things are socially constructed. The value of money, for example, that's socially constructed. We have to agree that, yes, this is what $1 is worth, and if we, because it's nothing but a piece of paper, it's an object. But if we largely agree together, yes, it has a value, and here's how it's stratified, and here's the purchasing power of it, etc., then it has a use. So that's a good example of a genuine social construction. But now in the universities, you are hearing things, even on our own campus, about social constructivism where race is a social construct. That's wrong. There's no compromising there. Now, I think in the case of gender, it's true that there is some social constructivism to gender, right? We sort of agree that maybe this is the way a man would present himself, or this is the way a woman would present himself. So there is an element of social constructivism in there. But the idea of race being purely a social construct is wrong. And when you lie about that, and you dishonestly assert that it is nothing more than a social construct, what you are doing is you are jeopardizing people's health and safety and well-being. Because, first of all, forensic scientists with greater than 85% accuracy are able to find human remains. They could have been somewhere for decades, and all they have are bones to look at. And simply based on the structure of those bones, they can determine with greater than 85% accuracy what the race of that person was. Now that has some real utility, because if it's someone who was murdered, now we can take that information and we can perhaps draw a composite. We can compare that to lists of people who've been reported as missing and see if we can solve the crime. If we were to throw our hands in the air and say, well, it was all just a social construct, who could know? We have no way of knowing. Then we wouldn't even bother to look at that, and we would have crimes that went unsolved. Or how about people whose ethnicity makes them more likely to suffer from certain illnesses? I don't want any of my friends who happen to be black not get checked for sickle cell anemia, because biologically speaking, we know that because of their genetics and their race, they are more susceptible to it. I would prefer that they are screened early so that they might avoid it, and then they don't have disastrous health consequences over it. That's not going to happen if we all start to agree that these are just social constructs that we all imagined and agree upon together for no objective basis. So the idea of social constructivism is largely wrong in most of the cases where it's being applied today, and it is dangerous. This is a manipulation of language. And the people who are in control have seized providence over language, and that is the main tool by which they subvert the current ideology. Confucius said, "When words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom." And I think that's right. If names not be correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success. Terrific words of wisdom from Confucius. The control of language itself is a key step in establishing a totalitarian state. That's how it always starts. And American colleges and universities have established full spectrum dominance, as our intelligence agencies like to refer to it, over the production of new language, as well as executive control over the maintenance of existing language. So now we have new terms that we've been asked to live with and acknowledge. Institutional racism, for example. Can an institution be racist? It's just a building. It's just an idea. People can be racist. There's no question about that. But I'm not sure how an institution itself could be racist, or systemic racism, which doesn't actually tell us anything. Systemic racism means a system itself that is racist. Okay, well, that doesn't point to anything that's racist in it. Don't just proclaim it to be something. Point to what it is and show me, and then we can work on changing that together. That's the way that you solve a problem. White privilege. There's another one. What does that mean? Well, it depends on who you ask, right? If I brought some of my friends in from the northern tip of the Appalachian poverty belt, they wouldn't appear very privileged to most of you. But we could surely find people who happen to have a complexion similar to mine that are well off. And so we could simply point to them and say, well, look, they're privileged and it's because of how they look. Well, that's a very superficial analysis. That's a very superficial way to judge someone. I know that the reason for your success is because one particular element of your identity caused that. Not very scientific. Intersectionality, one of my least favorite terms. Anyway, objections to ideas today, if you object to some of these things, then your objection is typically characterized as fear, because it's called a phobia. These don't appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology, by the way. They're just borrowing the word phobia and attaching it to that thing that they don't like that you object to make it look like you have a psychological disorder. That's the reason you don't agree with them. It's a psychological disorder. You couldn't have a legitimate disagreement with people who are putting these pernicious ideas out. It must be a psychological disorder. You're transphobic, or you're homophobic, or you're Islamophobic. None of those are actual conditions. They've just stolen the word, which has a scientific ring to it, and attached it to what they want to attach it to in order to have you cast as the bigot in the argument. If you have an objection to an idea, they won't even listen to it. You're simply labeled as racist, sexist, biased, anti-this, anti-that. A classic Marxist move in ideological subversion is to establish and define a new concept. And we do that in the academy, in the university. We call that a theory. It becomes a bona fide theory when some small group of us agree that it's legitimate within the institution. So we validate it ourselves. We invent it, and then we validate it. And then we use our authority as instructional leaders in the community or in the country in order to advance those terrible ideas. It's a closed loop system. Now, the problem is that when this begins to corrode and divide society, we begin to tribalize. So instead of having unified people who happen to live in a diverse country, who come from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds and all different sexualities and all kinds of things, instead of having some common theme that we can unite under, this pernicious idea, this ideological subversion, this Marxism, postmodernism, whatever you want to call it, and it has many different forms, which is what makes it such a complicated thing to understand and unpack. it begins to divide us into our groups, and that's when we become tribalized. And so by tribalized, I mean now it's my group against your group, against her group, against his group, against their group. Group, 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 group. Why are we doing that? We're all Americans. We should all be concerned about the things that affect us together, equally, among all of us. We should not wear our identity around on our sleeve or put that out as our main sail. We should put our humanity out there first, because that's something we all have in common. The wedge issue, typically, is the idea that your subjective sense of self should govern all interactions and your conversations with others. Now, that is a dangerous idea. That is to say that whatever your subjective view is of yourself, which we all have a subjective view of ourselves, that is what everyone else should be forced to respect and acknowledge. Well, it's simply not true. What if I demanded from people that they view me a certain way? I demand that you view me as more important than the mayor of this city. I demand that you view me as the person who's correct in every argument. How about that? Would that work? Would that be a good subjective sense of self that I might impose on people? It certainly would for me. Now, I've talked in classes at length about the diversity, equity, and inclusion industrial complex, which, and this is a couple years behind now, but recently was billed as an $8 billion a year industry. Diversity and inclusion itself are interdependent in this sense. Both exist as tools that rely on each other. One cannot have noble ends of diversity without the righteous means of inclusion. The larger goal of the two is to create equity or equal shares of property for Marx, equal shares of the private property of ideology. This is what has been tried in Maoist China, in Stalin's Russia, the idea that the government would administer equal shares to everyone, equal shares of everything to everyone. What is one of the major moves? How do they push this ideological subversion in order to divide people? Well, one theme is to, you may have heard this before, move the margins to the center and the center to the margins, which is to say, you define the mainstream or the majority based on the privileges that they may enjoy. And then you attribute those to being the private property of ideology in some way. And therefore, anyone who does not fit perfectly into that mold that you've cast is, by definition, someone who is marginalized. This is the oppressed and oppressor model. It creates victims and oppressors. And this is what is so dangerous and divisive. People have all sorts of traits that can locate them outside the mainstream. You, me, all of us, in some way, no matter who we are or what we look like, there are things about us in our past that would situate us outside the mainstream. The mainstream is just an ideal, ideologically speaking. So no one fits perfectly into it. You could take the wealthiest person in the world and find character flaws with them. You'd be able to look through their past and see that they've had trials and tribulations that were no different than anybody else. So nobody fits perfectly in this mainstream. So that's the first mistake. When you move the margins to the center and the center to the margins, what you're doing is you next expand the categories. So a lot of this movement began in the feminist movement, second wave feminism somewhere in the 1960s, which had a legitimate basis. There were legitimate complaints that women had, right? We did need to make modifications in our society to adjust so that women were treated with greater respect and more equally as persons in our society. That's true. There's always a kernel of truth here that supports this. But now, what is it? Can anyone even define it anymore? I ask my classes that, and almost no one dares raise their hand. Having a characteristic that situates yourself outside of the mainstream just makes you slightly imperfect or different. It doesn't make you oppressed or marginalized. We all have some category about us, something about us that situates us outside of the perfect ideal majority. And that is generally why they like to use the term social justice. Because in this country, we have actual justice, which is blind, which means it doesn't matter where you're from, or who you like, or how you pee, or how you present yourself in public, whatever your preferences are, or whatever people's opinions are of you. It doesn't matter. you are treated equally. Now, it's not saying that it's a perfect system. People get dispossessed and railroaded in our justice system all the time. That's true. But we have some pretty good measures to correct that when it does happen. So the idea of actual justice is the one that we ought to be aspiring to, because that impacts every person equally. Social justice sets up a hierarchy where some people are favored over others. That's the problem with social justice. The only justice out there is actual justice. With that, I want to move on to Paulo Freire, who was the Brazilian Marxist who has become the big hero in education. And to understand just a little bit about Freire, he has a genuinely terrible history when he was a kid. His father worked for the state in Brazil. His father was a police officer. And during one of the revolutions in that part of the world, or change of government, they lost everything. They lost their money. He was hunting for food in garbage cans. I mean, worse than we could imagine most people even in this country have it today. That's a terrible thing. And it seems to have affected him. And it seems to have determined his course in life, because he became a Marxist who was interested in doing away with this style of governance in favor of a socialist model. And the way that he deploys his theory in education today in the universities is through the idea of generative themes. He repeats this over and over in his works. So for Freire, political education is the only education that's actually relevant, that actually matters. So Freire doesn't actually care about teaching you math or teaching you how to read and write or teaching you anything that's actually valuable. He wants to use those terms, or he wants to use those subjects in the schools and then supplant that, replace that with something else that is more aimed at political education. And this is a Marxist sleight of hand that he uses. So for example, you could look at a second grade math problem and they might say, like, Johnny is on his way to the amusement park. His parents are driving him to the amusement park and it's 50 miles away and they have traveled 20 miles already. How much further does Johnny and his family need to go to make it to the amusement park? Simple math, right? The generative themes idea under Freire is that you would take that actual math problem and use it to start a different conversation with the second graders. So instead of actually getting to the simple answer of it, and moving on, learning that and moving to something else, you take that and you say, now why might he be on the, how many of you have been to an amusement park in here? Oh, some of you haven't been to an amusement park. Well, why haven't you been to an amusement park? Why do you think you've been to an amusement park and he hasn't? Is it maybe because your parents don't have enough money to go? Is this a thing that only wealthy people can do? Who gets to enjoy the amusement park and who doesn't? Now you've taken that math problem, which on its surface looked perfectly innocuous and something you would expect in any second grade class, and you've flipped it and you've converted it into a conversation about economics and politics and race and everything else. And this is the sleight of hand. This is the generative theme that Freire talks about over and over and over ad nauseum in his works. Freire sees traditional education, he refers to it as banking transactions, simply learning how to connect disconnected syllables. He wants people to see the political context of your real concrete conditions, especially if you are one of the oppressed. And that occurs through the use of these generative themes. Knowledge is a gift bestowed upon students, like making deposits in accounts, like banking transactions. So that's his idea of traditional education. He wants that completely flipped. So you can take some of the methods that they use, the math example that I gave you, and you use that to start other conversations. Now you have second graders sitting around talking about politics and sex and gender and race and economics all day long instead of learning math. So it's not just that they're teaching something that they really don't have any business teaching in these schools. They've actually stolen that education away from people and replaced it with something else. So you're creating huge deficits. Freire's goal was to create the perpetual cultural revolution. So he doesn't even have a pinpoint goal where he wants to get to a point and then, okay, we've won, now we can move on or we can do things differently. He wants perpetual cultural revolution. That is his explicit goal, and he states that over and over. Trigger the learners, and then you abstract from the superficial problem your ability to talk about that in terms of politics. For Freire, you're not marginalized because you're marginalized. You're marginalized because some marginalizer set up a system that maintains marginalization in order to marginalize you. And the way to resolve this is to conscientize, or in his Portuguese language, consciencializar, which roughly translates to thought reform, or what we might know as brainwashing, to reorient the conscience of people. Now, can you imagine? Your kids are going to these schools, and this is the heart and soul of the lesson, is they don't want to teach them math, they don't want to teach them reading and writing and history and those things. They want to conscientize them. In other words, change the conscience so that they're reoriented in a different political direction. Again, quo warranto. Under what authority? Who gave you the mandate to do that? Shina is what they would have called that in the Maoist re-education camps under Mao's China. Shina. Wash brain. All right. So how does this manifest, and what are we seeing today that is the net result of all this pernicious so-called education? Well, I think you could go back to 2020 and look at the riots that occurred for 3.5 months. It took many people's lives who had nothing to do with anything, and all the businesses that were destroyed and the constant rioting that went on, which incidentally was cheered on by the mass media and at least half of politics. When you look at the current situation today with Israel and Palestine, I think you see the same volatile situation. So fortunately for us, the mass media has kind of stayed out of this. I mean, they're showing what's going on, but they're not deliberately agitating in the way that they were in 2020. They're not deliberately cheering these things on, encouraging people. But if you look around at the college campuses and see some of the nonsense that's going on behalf of these students, you can see, boy, it would not take very much, just a little nudge from the mass media, and we'd have this spilling out into the streets, and we'd have months and months worth of violence again. What you're seeing is the result of destabilization. Once a country is destabilized, and we are clearly at that stage, then it only takes a few weeks to push the country to crisis. So you take a destabilized nation where you faction people off into different tribes and camps, and everybody's got a grievance, and these people are mad at these people, and these people are mad at everybody, and I'm mad at you, and you're oppressing me, and now everyone's divided, and it's so volatile that any incident can really be used to create the next crisis. After all, these kids on college campuses who are rioting over the Israel and Palestine issue, 5 minutes ago, they couldn't find either of these countries on a map. They have no idea. There's no way that they could understand the complexities of what's going on. They don't know the history of it. And so we may look at that and go, what is this craziness? Why are they acting like this? It doesn't make any sense. Why do they even care about it? They're college kids. Don't they want to go to parties and like talk about other things and use their social media? Why are they out rioting? And it's because whatever the purported issue is, it doesn't matter. What matters is the revolution. That's what you need to keep in mind. So when you see this sort of discontent swell up in society and spill out into these places, and it's puzzling to you. 5 minutes ago they were arguing about pronouns or whatever it is that college kids argue about on these university campuses, and now all of a sudden they're mad as hell over this Israel and Palestine issue. By the way, before Israel even responded, they were out there rioting and throwing a fit. And it's puzzling to people. You go, how could this happen? Well, why would they have any interest in this whatsoever? And the answer is they don't have any interest in it. What they have an interest in is perpetuating the revolution. That's what it's about. It's about moving the revolution forward. So it doesn't matter what the issue itself is. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to put you to sleep with Karl Marx and Paulo Freire. And what I want to show you, I think some of you have seen this already, but this is a KGB agent who defected in the 1970s and came to the United States. And it was during a time of great naivety in the United States when we felt like the Cold War was being fought based on who had more tanks and who had more bombs and who had the strategic advantage. The Soviet Union realized rather quickly that it was a moot point. You could no longer win a war because when both parties are armed with nukes, you're just going to cancel each other out. They launch on us, we launch on them. Nobody wins. So how do you defeat your adversary when each of you is nuclear armed? How do you do that? And the answer is you use ideological subversion. And nobody knows this better or deeper or more personally than the Russians. who were subjected to it themselves in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And so they had used ideological subversion in the 1950s and the 1960s in order to perpetuate and start sowing these seeds of discontent. So let me show you very briefly what he had to say about that.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. Only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of United States society. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically America is stuck with demoralization, and unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. They will join the links of dissenters, dissidents.
Yes.
Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be a greatest shock for them, of course. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. It's the system, however ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy. Whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. You have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking with every second. The disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
All right, so I hope that video was able to help you connect some of the dots as to what's happening and where we're going. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, the interesting thing is when he mentioned the communist conspiracy. This idea of Marxism is itself a conspiracy theory. It supposes that there's a system in place and that people are using this ideological private property to protect things for themselves at the expense of others. That's the conspiracy theory. But what's interesting is whenever you talk to someone about this who is actually a Marxist themselves, the first thing that they do is turn it around on you and accuse you of being the conspiracy theorist. So you say to someone like, I think these are pernicious ideas, they're bad, they're causing damage, etc. And their reaction is oftentimes, wow, well, you're quite the conspiracy theorist, which is a very interesting way to approach it. I know you are, but what am I? Most of us outgrew that a long time ago. The one who smelt it dealt it. It's just not a very clever counter argument when you're going after these Marxists. So here's what I'm going to end on. I have one more to show you. This one's only about a minute and a half long. If you really wanted to see what some of the result looks like of this type of indoctrination of dividing people and fueling these fires and making them upset about things, we just came off of Thanksgiving. And so here is a take on Thanksgiving that I think is worth paying attention to.
Happy Thanksgiving, America. I'm Donna, and I'm here with my friends to tell you the real history behind this holiday. Growing up, I knew that what they told you in school about Thanksgiving wasn't true. That's not the true story. The true story behind Thanksgiving was, after every killing of a whole village, these European settlers celebrated it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln became president that it became an official holiday.
He ordered 38 Dakota men to be hung for war crimes.
After the sacred holiday Christmas.
We take this time to remember our elders who lost their lives due to what really happened. Usually my mom makes a Native American dish for us and we pray.
Growing up, I would be kind of annoyed that they didn't know what actually happened on Thanksgiving and that they're actually celebrating the deaths of many people and many tribes that were lost.
Whether it's to give thanks or to be with your family, you should learn how the holiday was established in the first place.
I'm thankful for being born indigenous to this continent.
I'm thankful that I still have my culture.
I'm thankful that my elders kept our culture alive all these years.
I'm thankful to be indigenous, resilient, and alive.
I'm thankful for us all to be able to stand together, stand strong, and stand as one.
Happy Thanksgiving, America.
Just absolutely awful. And again, the mechanism there is that totally false? Largely. However, there are some kernels of truth there. It is true that Native Americans were treated horribly when there were settlers here. Some of those stories have kernels of truth to them, but you take that kernel of truth and you expand on it, you purport to be putting the fire out, but you're really dumping gas on it, and you end up with angry kids like that who are not going to do a lot of good in the world. And it's hard to imagine how do we bring them back together with the rest of us to acknowledge the fact that we're all human beings first and also Americans, and so we're in this together, and so we've got to figure out a way forward. I would assert to you that the way forward here is to raise awareness, to be aware of exactly what you're being exposed to, and to call people out on things. So when someone is in a course and they're putting forth one of these terrible ideas, perhaps it's something to do with social constructivism, or it's perhaps a hijacked conversation about race and gender in a math class or somewhere else. I think you should exercise your freedom of speech and your right as a student to demand evidence to support that, or to argue it, or to counter it in some way. And that's where all of this starts. So spreading awareness is how we take care of this. Boy, in the worst moment of that video, as angry as they looked, and the things that they were saying and the way that their demeanors were, I was just waiting for one of their iPhones to go off with a message tone under the table. Anyway, thank you very much for coming today. I hope I didn't keep any of you too late. I appreciate you coming in here and having to listen to this. So thank you very much.